got a list of questions coming up, and all our speakers, and Keith, remote, Professor Fox is with us. Can you hear us, Keith?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
And we can hear you. That's great. Good. So the questions are going to pop up on the screen here, and we'll just take them in the order that they come. So perhaps we could have the first question. How does your view of natural philosophy contrast with that developed by Andrew Peacock? He might mean Arthur Peacock. So I think we're going to direct that question to Lucas. Would you like to use this microphone?
I think this one will work.
Okay, but we don't need one from down there, perhaps. Do we need another one? No. Okay. Right. Okay.
I hate to try and sum up Arthur so quickly, so I think I will evade the question slightly and just say it's very interesting to read both Peacock and Polkinghorne, both of whom I respect greatly, one of whom is a biologist and one of whom is a physicist. And I think that biologists, like Peacock and myself, are much less confident that we will have these universal rules that physics comes up with so neatly and biology doesn't. So I think this is a big difference in the sorts of natural theology you will see from biologists and from physicists.
Yeah, there's a story of, I think it was recounted by Eric van Alken of his time in Oxford as a student, when he used to go to listen to C.S. Lewis with a group of other students. He discovered a number of them were scientists, biologists, chemists, and physicists. And he remarked that the biologists thought that as biologists they didn't have all the answers, but basically the chemists would understand what was going on. And the chemists, they said, well, no, actually, it's more fundamental than that. The physicists would know the answers to everything you need to know. And what he was trying to explain was why there seemed to be more Christians amongst the physicists than amongst the other scientists. And when they got to the physicists, he said, well, physicists realized we don't know the answers to these things. Oh, they're much more humble in their approach. So there is a kind of different culture, I think, in our approach, the way we do science in the different disciplines. So that might partly account for it. Let's have the next question. Anyone else want to comment on that from another perspective? Okay, let's move on to the next question then. I think this one's going to Sharon here. Do you think that the brain may be connected to the world outside the body, near death, etc., or how does this relate to the religious experience?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if it came from the room or from someone online. But yes, the whole area of near-death experiences has really kind of grown since the 1960s, and particularly the 70s and 80s, since we've been able to resuscitate patients in cardiac arrest. And so patients that were in a state of essentially clinical death and then were resuscitated began to report to their clinicians that they had had a kind of vividly conscious experience while their brain was in shutdown. And of course, perhaps the materialist or the naturalist might make the case that, well, there's just no detectable brain signal going on, that there is still residual brain activity. And that may well be true, but I think the question that we need to answer is, why is there such a disproportionality that, in theory, when your brain is in complete shutdown and all the areas of your cortex known to correlate with consciousness are in shutdown, and yet these experiences are of vivid consciousness? And of course, if you are just your brain, this kind of data set makes very little sense. There isn't really a framework. And kind of like Lucas said this morning, we're not wanting to use near-death experiences as a proof of the existence of God or of an afterlife. However, if God exists, we can make some sense of this kind of data set, because we know that the death of the body and brain is not the end of consciousness for the human being. Now, we don't have all the answers. We haven't made a sense of all of the different aspects, but it's certainly something that we have a framework for making sense of if God exists, that we don't quite have in the same way if he doesn't. And it's fascinating, really. And what's particularly interesting about it is it's a data set that has religious implications, but it's being gathered in a clinical scientific context. And so it's quite unique in that sense. And there's probably more work to be done in the field of near-death experiences. Thank you for the question.
Anyone like to add a comment to that? I know that from my own experience of being with someone near death, and the doctors have told me that the hearing is the last of the senses to go. So even when the person appears to have gone, they can still hear. And that, in one situation, was very comforting for me. I was able to pray with the person who was dying, and they were able to hear it. And I just wonder whether there's any significance to the fact that hearing a word is, in a sense, the last of our senses to go, and before we die, that even at the very end, God can speak to us, even through another person, or bring comfort in that way.
Oh, I was going to add to that a story. My grandmother had fairly severe dementia near the end of her life, and we process music differently than we process words. And it was very moving to me that we could sing together long after we could talk to each other. And I think there is this important aspect of worship which has to do with processing things in that way and sort of building in a repertoire of songs that will, I hope, be with me long after other faculties have gone.
And there's even the sense that music is a kind of non-verbal communication, that it convey emotion and sense and meaning even without words. Interesting. Good. Perhaps have the next question. Do you think the mind evolved? Let's start with Chris on that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I was wanting to have a chat later, but you know, one of the things I saw in terms of looking at it from the genetic perspective was some comparative studies now of chimpanzee, Neanderthal, and human DNA sequences, and trying to discern or identify which were the sequences that were unique to human DNA. And that was, I think, quite interesting that the ones they identified tended to be involved in brain development, but I'm on shaky ground here, and self-awareness, which seemed to have, the implication was that those had arisen after the separation of Homo sapiens from other hominids. So that, I mean, just in my own level of thinking, that made me wonder whether that capacity for a relationship with God, for the self-awareness that then led to an awareness of other, could have some sort of genetic background, and in that sense, I guess you would say, evolved as part of our species. But I think the work is quite preliminary. The number of Neanderthal DNA sequences available is relatively few, so you know, we have to wait, I think, to see more data.
I wonder if Professor Fox, Keith, could you comment on that question?
I can't add much more to it, but I confirm what was just said. Is my understanding is when you look for genes or proteins that were expressed or present in the human genome that aren't in the chimpanzee, is some of those relate to aspects of brain development. But actually, when you look for them, they are present in the Neanderthal genome. So that doesn't in any way say what's special about us as Homo sapiens. It doesn't really answer the question, but to amplify on that.
Just a caution to add to that. I feel like when people ask this question, sometimes there's an aspect of nothing buttery. If you've heard this expression before, the brain, the mind is nothing but the brain. It's clear that eyes have evolved, but that doesn't mean that light is an illusion. There is something out there which the eyes evolved to process. So it's entirely possible that the mind evolved, but it evolved to process an experience of the divine which was actually out there. Those are somewhat distinct questions, that I wouldn't want us to get confused.
I think I'll give the last word to the neuroscientist here.
Thank you for the question as well. And I would just, I guess, I know that you're asking about the human mind, but I think it's really important to bear in mind the kind of big picture framework that we're really operating with if we call ourselves Christians, which is that God exists. And if God exists, it is possible to have a mind without a body, which is controversial amongst some people, potentially. But the first words of the Bible say, in the beginning, God created. So before there was anything material, there was God. And God is a conscious being of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. One center of consciousness in three persons, or three centers of consciousness, depending on how you want to think about it. And so that is the framework that we are operating with, and it's somehow this God kind of, created human beings in his image, which means with that same capacity of mind. And so I guess in terms of our big picture framework, and then of course we have this fascinating concept of the incarnation. What's going on there, where we have this kind of, the kind of eternal mind of God and of Christ being amalgamated with the physical as well. And so there's lots to mine in this whole question. I think I would just kind of add that, and even whatever the genetics is saying, whatever neuroanatomy is saying, that, the prefrontal lobes were the last to kind of evolve, and those are the areas that are recruited in kind of higher thinking and abstract thought and so on. It's, we can definitely say those are neural correlates of the kind of mental processes going on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is the thing. And so there may be parallel levels and layers of explanation that, anthropology and neuroscience are telling us, but also we need theology and philosophy to make sense of that as well.
Is there, if I pick you up there, Sharon, is there an implication there that the brain as an organ had to develop to a certain level or develop certain aspects in order for minds to come into being? In other words, there could be brains without minds in the sense that we understand the word minds. Some low animals or living forms have a brain that controls their movement and so on, but that they don't have minds in the sense that we are. They're not self-conscious as far as we know. Fruit flies are not aware of their existence, but they do make spontaneous actions that are not purely determined by their environment. So there is a brain there that causes them to jump and do things, but they don't think as far as we know. Anybody have any fruit fly friends? No, I don't think they think in that sense. So is that sensible to think that the brain evolved to a certain degree of complexity, and only then could mind begin to come into existence, to emerge, shall we say?
I think even this is complex, and I think that we see that there are levels of consciousness in the animal kingdom, and I don't know if it's true that, I think it probably is true that as you work up the evolutionary tree or whatever we call it, that those levels do grow. But there is still something, distinctive about human beings. It seems that, our kind of domestic household pets have an awareness of their external environment, and they seem to have some degree of emotional life. They get scared when there's a storm. They're pleased to see you at the end of the day, even when no one else is. And they have a degree of an emotional life, but do they crawl into their kennel at the end of the day and say, I had a really terrible day today, that cat round the corner really giving me grief, I mean, and of course there are animal studies, there are behavioral studies that can get at some of this. One of those is kind of mirror recognition. If you place a human being in front of a mirror, they know that the reflection is another person, is themselves, but if you put an animal in front of a mirror, they think it's another animal, which is taken to be an indication of what's going on internally, is not as deep as what's going on internally for a human being, and so there are differences.
So we do have different relationships between our animals and our humans. I mean, your dog doesn't is happy to see you at the end of the day, and I mean, my dog doesn't mind if I leave my socks in the middle of the floor the way my wife does. So they react to different things in different ways.
You can eat them, perhaps.
Lucas, did you want to come in final comment here?
Oh, I just wanted to add dolphins, elephants, some, I think maybe corvids actually pass the mirror test. So it isn't just humans that can identify themselves in a mirror.
Interesting.
How one conducts that experiment is...
You put paint on their back and see whether they reach around and try and touch it. Because if you don't recognize that it's you, then you can't do the spatial reasoning to do that. So that test has been done, and we used to think it was just humans, and we now know there are several other species that can reason that way.
Good. Let's move on to the next question, shall we? Why do you think the church has been so silent on the genetic debate? Has to be Chris.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, something I've thought about myself. I mean, I think one thing is, it's, as you've seen, I hope, from what I've presented, it's a very diverse set of technologies and applications. So I think, in one sense, there are bits of it that are perhaps picked up more than others. But to synthesize all that and take an integrated approach is quite challenging. Depends which church you're speaking about, but I guess the church has been, involved in a lot of other questions that it's had to answer recently that have perhaps dominated the debates. And perhaps this interface between the expertise outside the church and within. I mean, I think it's one of the examples of what CiS is doing very well is making that bridge really from the expertise in the science and reaching into the people you need to catch the ear of within the church in order to put this up the agenda in terms of something that needs to be approached. So it's probably a combination of factors, but I do think the complexity of the subject, the fact that the church has had other priorities in recent years, and then this real need to link the science and translate that science into language and ideas which are accessible to non-experts. Certainly in the field I've been in, that's often a challenge. So yeah, a number of, but I think it's fascinating to understand that, because until you understand it, you're not really going to overcome whatever barriers are there to that very important process.
Yeah, I wonder if Keith, I know Keith is a lay reader in the Anglican Church. Do you have a view on this issue?
Yes, thank you. I agree with what Chris has just said. I think one of the reasons why the church has not said anything is because it actually doesn't understand the complexity of the issue. There's a side of me that says I'd rather, if they didn't understand it, they kept quiet and talked nonsense. But it is the job of people like Chris and myself and plenty of others, and CiS involved in it, to educate the church so that they understand the issues that are involved. I think genetics is probably not the only example of a technology where we're trying desperately to catch up after the event, rather than think through the implications of things in advance. I think sometimes we're inclined to sit back and say, well, that's science fiction, it'll never happen, so let's not think about it. Whereas I think specific, especially in the genetic thing, we've seen that what is science fiction today quite quickly becomes science fact. And I think we need to be thinking very carefully about potential scenarios, some of which may never happen. But think carefully about them as Christians before they do, rather than trying to respond after the event when it's rather too late.
Thank you, Keith. I wonder, Lucas, another churchman scientist, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I just want to pass on, they've said that CiS does this, but you do this. You are Christians who are involved in the church. And, if I'm doing my job at CiS, it means that I'm helping you get the resources you need. But I believe that God has called many scientists to be scientists for the church. So please, any opportunity you have to do that, I think that's very exciting.
Yep, thank you, Lucas. Let's move on to the next question, shall we? So, neurostructures and networks change with learned skills. Is there any evidence of neural change between a new or old Christian in brain activity? I think we'd better ask Sharon about this one.
Are you putting me in the category of a new or an old Christian? Let me just ask you.
I'm too much of a gentleman to answer that question.
I'm sure that Chris and Lucas will have things to add as well. But so you're absolutely right. Thank you for the question. That the brain is very plastic and it does change even as we go in adult life and into our older years. That even then the brain can change for better or worse, depending on whether we use it and challenge it and so on. I'm not aware, there may be studies, but I'm not aware of studies looking at the brain connectivity in Christians. I guess I slightly joked about the new or old. The implication is that, do you mean numerically new and old? So you're referring to age. But actually, the Bible doesn't really talk about age. It talks about kind of maturity in Christ, and it talks about spiritual gifts, which include things like wisdom and discernment and understanding. And these actually transcend age. You can actually, you can actually meet a very young Christian that's only been a Christian for a few months, but they actually have wisdom and understanding that is not proportional to how long they've been in a relationship with Christ. Of course, there's still a growth to maturity, and Paul talks about milk and solid meal. There is a difference and there is a growth there. But I think that the way that we talk about kind of growth in the kingdom of God is different to how we talk about it in neuroscience. And so we might expect to see proportionality or disproportionality, depending.
Okay, thank you. Anyone would like to make any comment? Keith, come in on
Yeah,
that
what
one?
if I might add to that? I mean, to pick up what Sharon was saying about us being plastic in the way in which our brains develop, is that we are creatures of habit, aren't we? We learn to do things. And actually, spiritual habits also are things that we learn and develop over time. And I'm sure those who have developed spiritual disciplines over many, many years will be reinforcing those all the time. I think it says a lot about the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we behave. It is that no action is an action in isolation, is that it changes us and changes the way that we think. So I think as the way in which Christians develop can be a positive, something that we learn through habits. And sometimes we take habits as being a bad thing, but I think in terms of Christian discipline and discipleship, I think there can be a lot to be said for that's positive in developing a Christian mind.
Thank you, Keith. Let's have the next question then. In the 20th century, the champion of biblical orthodoxy, for example, B.B. Warfield, saw no problem with evolution. What happened to conservative evangelicals? Well, let's go to Dr. Mix on that one first.
So this is a difficult topic, particularly as an American, because Americans get very vexed about this. There was a time when evangelicals in the United States really, really liked the separation of church and state because they thought the mainline Protestants were running the state and they wanted to make sure that they didn't mess with them. And then sometime in the 60s and 70s, they found out, well, wait a second, we could run the state. So we don't want separation of church and state. I think for me, this is an example of the church is a human institution and it is subject to the same temptations that humans are. as part of the fall, and that churches fall into this pattern of being scared and wanting more control. So my suspicion is that's what happened, but it is a historical question that we might need a historian of religion to tackle properly.
Anyone else like to comment on that one? It's a difficult sociological question, isn't it? And I know.
Can I come in on that?
Yes, just Keith, by all means, come to our rescue here. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure about coming to the rescue, but I think it is a peculiarly American phenomenon. And the whole question of young earth creationism really is an invention of 1920s, or maybe a few years beforehand. There's little history of that sort of thing in the centuries before, really. And many of the leading US biologists who were Christians in the late 19th century were quite accepting of evolution. Now, maybe the Scopes trial had something to do with it, and that, again, muddled politics with religion and with power. So I can't give a straight answer to that, but it is certainly worth remembering that people like B.B. Warfield didn't see any problem with evolution, and that somehow the movement seemed to get hijacked subsequently.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did touch on social, historical issues, particularly in the United States. I remember reading a paper that traced the problem right back to the American Civil War, when there was a division between the northern and southern states. And the northern states were kind of, in general, identified with a more liberal theology, and the southern states, the more conservative, fundamentalist approach to the Bible. And this became another dividing line between North and South, that even after the Union and the peace, the churches didn't actually reunite. The Baptist, Northern and Southern Baptist churches didn't unite. I think that might still be separate to this day. And that split occurred at the time of the Civil War. So those kind of political factors came into the issue to kind of distort people's view. And I think it's based, my own personal opinion is that the problem lies not with the science, but with the approach to the Bible, how we read the Bible. And a tendency of some church groups to feel that the Bible needs to be defended instead of letting the Bible speak for itself, and learn how to read the Bible in an intelligent way. And much of the problem comes down to how we read and understand the Bible and how it actually works. That it's not a rule book as such, that it hasn't been sort of handed down. It's an interaction between God and humanity that we have discovered through experience of the Israelite people and through Christ and disciples ever since, how God interacts with us. And we learn in that kind of dynamic way, in a relationship with God, not just following a text, that we listen to God speaking through his Spirit. Next question. At what point did the world cease to be very good? Did the fall change the nature of reality? Aha. I'm tempted to answer that one myself, but I'll hold my voice for a minute. Okay. I'm going to ask Keith to start off on that one.
I don't think the fall affected reality in terms of the way in which the world operates. It's the physical, biological, chemical properties are exactly the same after as before the fall. What changed is our interaction with it. So that work no longer was, work became drudgery. It felt as though we were fighting against the world rather than cooperating with it. So I would say that the world didn't change. And when we read the Genesis accounts of being good, that I don't think has any great moral implications to it. That word good really just means fit for purpose. It works. It's as good as it gets. Now go ahead and work with it, says God. Now take care of it. Make it even better if you can. So the moral and ethical implications of that are questionable, but it's certainly our relationship with the world and with each other and with God, all of that was radically corrupted at the event of the fall.
Chris, would you like to comment on that one?
Only very briefly, I mean, I think there's a sense in which, because the world of nature speaks about the character of God, there's an onus on us to respect that and value that and conserve it so that that image of God is not lost. So that's one thing. I agree with what Keith has said otherwise about the no specific change. But I also think there's this onus on us, an opportunity to modify in order to make life better for people. So, I think that's where some of the genetic technology is very positive. I mean, we look at the production of the COVID vaccines with sort of mRNA technology, allowed a very rapid response to a new challenge from a natural pathogen. So I think it's a combination of respecting and caring for the world, because that's of value, because God created it and it reveals his nature. But also, it's not to the point where we can't interfere and improve the lives of people through that interference.
Anybody else like to add a comment there?
I would just want to add something to the conversation that as I've kind of wrestled with this, and so I just released a book called Broken Planet in February, which deals specifically with the question of natural disasters and diseases. And the way that I tackled that is by trying to gather stories from people around the world who have come face to face with their encounters with hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, pandemics, and so on, the things that are woven into the forces of nature, and then to try and wrestle with some of the apologetic kind of questions that come our way. And I think I definitely agree with the view that there's, that actually that nature kind of is the way it is largely because of mechanisms that have been built into the natural world, and many of those are needed to sustain life. Like, tectonic plates and so on are necessary to recycle nutrients from deep beneath the earth back to the surface, and viruses, as we have learned today, have a role evolutionarily, and they are vital for life. And if we were to get rid of them all, we wouldn't survive very long. And yet, somehow, we experience the impact of these things as disasters. We feel a brokenness, and I keep wrestling with that as I think about this question. Why is that? Why do we experience it as wrong? Why do we experience it as broken? And I think I have to also keep coming back to the chronologically the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, where we get an insight into a man's experience that he himself doesn't have. All he has is this stuff hit him, but he experiences actually 3 levels of suffering. He experiences suffering through moral evil, what philosophers might refer to as the way humans treat each other. There are raiders that come and wipe out his business and kill his cattle and so on. He also experiences the forces of nature doing something extraordinary, fires and a storm that blow down his house that collapses on his children and kills them. And then he also experiences biological disaster through the boils that take over his body, and so he's there as a result of what some philosophers would argue is natural evil. Now, I know that not everyone necessarily believes that that's a thing, but I just keep wrestling with it. I see that this chronologically oldest book of the Bible says, look, all of that has its origins not simply in a world that has been made good, which indeed it has, but also a world in which evil exists. And somehow evil has to have a place in the conversation around this. And there are some theologians that say, yeah, of course, it's not necessarily tied to a human fall, but was there an angelic fall that somehow impacted the natural world as well? And of course, Genesis 3 says nothing about that. Genesis 2, in fact, the serpent is in the garden already. The author of Genesis doesn't say how the serpent got there, how long he'd been there, how much havoc had been wreaked. All we know is this is the way it's always been as far as we can tell. But, you know, I sort of remain open to the possibility that there, you know, we have to have a theology that encompasses evil as well as natural mechanisms that have a role. And I feel like it's an amalgamation of both of those things.
Yeah, I think I would actually like to just finish off putting a few things together there by putting maybe a personal view, but I would question the premise of the question, which implies that there was an event in history, a point in time, whereas I think of the fall not as an event, but as a condition. That Genesis describes the human condition of being alienated from God because of our innate selfishness. And that is a statement for all humanity of all time. It didn't happen at some point, so that the world didn't suddenly change as a result of one event. That is built into the fabric, as you were saying, that we have to come to terms with that. And as Keith pointed out, the word good in Genesis has the sense of good for its purpose. And so if God's purpose is to make us like him, then he can allow, even intend, what we call natural evil, suffering, challenge, difficulty, as a way of forming our character, to learn to depend upon him, to trust him, to enter a relationship, to experience his power in those difficult situations that we wouldn't otherwise. And difficult though it may be for us to see and understand that completely, we can have trust in him that one day we will see not in a glass darkly, but as God himself sees us. And he calls us to trust him for the things we can't fully understand. And so the world is good. It's not broken. It's just the way God made it. It's beautiful. It's hard. It's difficult at times, but there's a purpose in it. And that's, I think, where the theology comes in. God has a reason for it. And Job didn't get the answer. He asked God for the reason. What he got was a relationship with God. Let's have another question. Does describing qualitative experience depend on the strength or capacity of our memories and not the experience itself? I'm sorry, Sharon, you're getting overburdened here, but that really is up to you, isn't it? Unless you want to come in, Lucas, on that one.
So this is a lovely neurological, biological question because, of course, we know that our memories are plastic and we don't actually remember experiencing things necessarily the same way, but continue to process them. And I guess I would move from the abstract question of what is the real me to the pragmatic question of how I deal with these experiences. And there's very interesting neurology to be done about how we experience the past and how we experience the present, and particularly in our response to trauma, because we know that in retelling stories in a safe environment, we can actually diffuse some of that trauma. And so the Christian story, I think, at a larger scale, is an opportunity for us to process our suffering, and that getting away from the question of who's at fault for our suffering to how does God help us process our suffering, for me, is an important Christian move.
Thank you. Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I've got a feeling I don't know if I'm going to answer it, but I'm going to just tell you a story about my mother-in-law who died during the second lockdown in the north of England, actually, where my family is from. And we were just organising her funeral. And we were praying for a minister that could say something meaningful, because we were in Oxford and she kind of lived her last few years up in this other part of the country. And actually this minister said he could take the funeral. And as we were exchanging information, and we sent him a photo, he said, "You're not going to believe this, but I've actually met your mum. I went into her care home about 6 months before the pandemic started. And Conrad's, my mum-in-law, died of dementia, vascular dementia. And at the time that he went to take communion for a couple that used to be in his church, and Penny was the only other person in the room, and he invited her to see if she wanted to take communion with them and be part of this service, and she accepted. And she was able to recite parts of this communion service, pray the Lord's Prayer, and take communion in a way that seemed to really mean something for her. Now, what you need to know is, at that point, she could no longer remember that she had 3 children or what their names were, and her speech was incoherent all the time. And yet, there she was, connecting with God in a way that was totally disproportionate to what was happening in her brain and her mind, in fact. And so there is something about this that is deeply mysterious, that reminds us that as people, we are highly complex. And we're not going to bottom out this question and sort it and box it. But there is something about the human being that is both proportional to what's happening in the brain, but also at times seems to transcend it. And so that was really insightful for me as I think about this.
Thank you, Sharon. I think it's a good point on which to end. Thank you, Sharon, and to Chris and Lucas and to Keith.